Hi, welcome to my COVID-19 crisis pocket lecture. I have been studying, researching, and fighting economic and financial crisis for the better part of the last 30 years. But let me tell you, this crisis is really different. And when economists say, or other people say, this crisis is different, usually they are wrong. Because most financial and economic crises are very similar. They may not seem so initially, but they turn out to follow similar patterns and have similar underlying reasons. This one here is truly different, and actually all economists, experts, and policymakers would agree with this. What makes it different? Well, it's bigger. It's faster, it's deeper than anything we have seen over the last century and outside wars. It is truly, and this is important, truly exogenous. And when economists say exogenous, what we mean is that it is not a response by a behavioral response to some kind of imbalance in the economic system itself. So it doesn't come from within, but it does come from outside, and in that sense is also a common shock. However, what we are also seeing and increasingly appreciating, that this common shock is hitting different regions of the world, different agglomerations, different countries in a very different manner. And moreover, we also see that their capacity to respond to them in policy terms differs significantly, and this then has consequences for the economic side. But another thing that makes this crisis different is that the economic recession here is a medical necessity and ultimately government mandated. It is the necessary responses that governments have mandated the economy to lock down, and therefore they are also in a different position and in a different responsibility than they would be normally. And last but not least, this crisis is hitting the world in a way, in a moment where it is absolutely unprepared for this. It's very poorly prepared for this kind of large, common, systematic shock. So in my pocket lecture, what I want to do is first to recall the interaction between the medical and the economic fundamental logic, then talk about some experiences in Asia that make me think that this is not over and it could still go on for quite a long time. We'll look at the economic side of what we know so far has happened, and then I will give a brief outlook. So let's start with the fundamental medical and economic systems, which you see in this graph, which on the top side shows the new cases, the epi curve that by now I think is familiar to everybody, and the need to contain it, to flatten it as a consequence of not overwhelming hospitals and of not creating unnecessary deaths because people cannot be offered the best treatment that we presently can offer them. However, flattening the epi curve also means steepening the economic curve, and this is the bottom side of this graph. So the blue line becomes steeper, the economic recession becomes bigger by implementing the containment measures that are on the medical side. This is quite intuitive. And then if you think about what economic policy can do, then you're looking at the green line and the green arrow, which points towards the possibilities of flattening the economic recession line. So in that sense, this has also been called the double flattening problem. But what the graph in a stylized manner does illustrate that even though you flatten both curves, there is still a significant economic recession that remains. Now, what this curve also suggests, though, is that you do this and then you have done it and you get out of it and it's done. And when we look at how China's activity has resumed, at least by some of these high frequency indicators that we have after they came out of their lockdown, then one could think that a V-shaped recovery is actually likely. At least that's what some of the indicators like the degree of pollution or the amount of traffic on roads, or also the purchasing manager index, which recovered quite fast, would indicate. Another lesson from Asia, however, is if you look at what Singapore has experienced. Singapore was very successful in containing the first wave. In fact, for 6 weeks after the crisis, after the medical crisis broke out, Singapore managed to keep, through containment, in particular through tracking, tracing, and isolating methods, keeping the new cases down to about 100. And this while keeping restaurants, schools, and offices open. So Singapore was seen and is still in many ways hopefully the future of what countries look like that can successfully contain the medical side through tracking and tracing. But then the virus escaped, and Singapore was first faced with a second wave, which was partly imported, and then a third wave, which was very concentrated and is very concentrated among migrant workers who live in very aggregated living conditions. And now Singapore had to go into an 8-week, what is called here the circuit breaker, a lockdown, in an asynchronous way with the rest of the world, advanced world, because second and third waves can strike, and they can be worse than the first one. So that's what the lesson from Singapore, at least one of the lessons from Singapore, is that it's not over after you have managed the first wave. But let's look at the economic side. Let's turn to the economic side. And for this, I am using here the forecasts that the International Monetary Fund has made very recently. The World Economic Outlook of April, so a few weeks ago, shows that the IMF is now forecasting world growth per GDP to be in a recession which is about double as bad, double as large as the one in the global financial crisis. And the number of countries that are going to experience negative per capita growth is also much, much higher than before. A full 90% of countries will see their GDP per capita decline this year. Moreover, as new data comes available, high frequency data becomes available, it is well possible that even this forecast will turn out to be relatively optimistic. Let me turn next to the crisis response by governments. There has been a very strong crisis response, both from central banks, but also this time around from fiscal authorities. Governments have really stepped up and have have put in place very large packages of fiscal expenditures in order to dampen the crisis, in order to provide the liquidity necessary for firms to survive, for households to survive. The bottom line here from the fiscal monitor of the IMF is that something in the area between 5 and 10% of GDP in additional expenditures, which is what is called here is above the line, have already been decided. But notable, and this is why I'm showing this graph, is the gray part, which are below the line, so-called below the line measures. They are guarantees, loans, promises to help liquidity injections for firms mostly. And you see that some of them are to the tune of some 30% of GDP. most notably in Germany and Italy. So these are really packages that are extraordinary in size and speed again. But as I was saying, it's not over. And the question that we are looking at is what is next? What is around the corner? In some ways, I would argue what has happened so far, and this may sound strange, but in some ways, this was the easy bit. A lot of the measures that governments have decided have to do with providing liquidity assistance, with providing loans, in the implicit assumption that these loans will be repaid. If there is a fast recovery, a lot of the firms should be able to go through this bump, through this extended holiday that they have, enforced holiday that they have had, without going out of business, without going into insolvency. However, if the crisis lasts longer, if the health crisis lasts longer, it will be, on the one hand side, much more difficult for governments to provide this kind of liquidity assistance. And second, a lot of the assumption of the underlying assumption that this is liquidity help may no longer be true. We may be looking at large-scale insolvencies in sectors such as hospitality, travel. We are already seeing large-scale injections into some of the big travel companies, and much more of this discussion will be coming forward as we are moving from the question of how to assist a liquidity crisis to the question who bears the losses of a solvency crisis. So the discussion will become more difficult because burden sharing between governments, shareholders, debt holders, but also central banks will start being the things that we are talking about. We also have a lot of huge uncertainties in front of us. It is quite likely that the present crisis will still lead to the deflationary picture, or maintain, even reinforce the deflationary trends that we have seen over the last years. But it is also possible that in the medium to longer run, inflation may come back. And last but not least, we're talking about large-scale debt in the private sector, in governments. And we are talking about an emerging markets and less developed country situation that will almost certainly have large problems in servicing their debt. From this point of view, it is extremely positive that the G20 has already decided on a debt standstill for the debt service of the low-income countries. And we are now in one of the discussions that is ongoing is how the private sector should participate in this debt standstill and how to organize the private sector participation. But the low-income countries, although there are many of them, are not actually where the big problem lies. The larger problems lie in emerging markets. And out of those countries, private capital has been flowing out at an amazing speed. So there is a crunch in these countries, and at the same time, they are facing a large decline in global demand and the medical crisis at home. So there are still a lot of things that have not been addressed, that have not been solved. Unfortunately, at the time of recording this lecture, I do not think that we are at the end tail of this crisis. We may actually be, hopefully, somewhere in the middle, more likely just somewhere in the early stages. Thank you for your attention.